We're going to begin by using a dynamics processor that's really more of a safety device, at least in this context. And then in the next couple of videos, we'll get into using it more as an effect. So that device is called the Loudmax, but don't let that name fool you into thinking that all it can do is make something really, really loud. That's one usage for it, but in our case, we're using this to control any kind of unruly peak signals. So for example, instead of feeding in here and getting a bunch of digital distortion if we're too loud, this will actually cut down when the signal breaches a predetermined threshold. And now there's only two controls on this particular effect, but it's still very powerful and in the wrong hands can completely ruin an entire song. Maybe ruin's not the right word, but it can completely change an entire song. And for our purposes here, we're really just setting this up to make sure that we don't get any digital overs. We don't have any digital clipping, and that could happen for a wide variety of reasons. When you're recording, especially when you're recording and people are plugging in cables and unplugging cables and not really being very considerate about what it could potentially do to microphones or to speakers, you always want to have some kind of peak limiter before you're going out to your speakers, because everybody has that story of somebody who's like plugging in and out a guitar from an amplifier and they're using a wrong cable, or they just jam it in too hard and it creates this really loud click or pop and breaks a speaker. That can happen because the speakers don't know when somebody's being an idiot, or when somebody or when something is happening unintentionally that you don't want to hear. The goal of the speaker is just to play back whatever it's getting as accurately as possible. So just because it won't sound like super loud to you, it doesn't mean that it can't break the speaker, and that happens a lot. And when you're making music as well, it's possible to have things like feedback loops or just glitches in the software that can like peak everything out really loud. And so again, you want to protect your speakers and you also want to protect your hearing as well. So putting something like a peak limiter, this Loudmax, and just like that, actually there's probably some sort of glitch, just like this, putting this on here is a good way of saving yourself and keeping it safe and making sure that you never have any digital overs. We don't want to be driving into this thing, at least not at this point, but that's another usage of it. We just want this here as a safety precaution, because at least when I'm making music, I'm still going to be making sure that I'm in that like -10 to -6 range of the loudest signal. So if all goes according to plan, I don't actually want to see this doing anything at all. But to showcase to you how this is working, I'm going to take this output, I'm going to move it down to 0.3. So what this is telling me is that whenever a signal goes over 0 decibels, okay, when any signal breaches that, which we then be getting into digital distortion, it's going to make sure that it clamps down on it and will not let it be any louder than 0.3 dB. Okay, so that may not make sense, but you'll understand soon enough how this is working. So if we're playing back our poem,
farewell, but whenever you welcome the hour that awakens the night song of mirth in your bower.
Right now, the peak, at least that we can see, is at -6.9. All right. But if I go in here and I start increasing this and I cross that 6.9 threshold, really, it means that we're then going to be going over 0 on the meter. And once we go over 0, we're going to be getting digital clipping. But with the Loudmax here, it's going to cut back on that and make sure that everything is only output at -3 dB. All right, so let's go ahead and let's put in like 12 for right now, and then keep an eye here on the master and the meter here and watch where it peaks out.
Farewell, but whenever you welcome the hour that awakens the night song of mirth in your bower, then think of the friend who once welcomed it too.
And every time you're seeing that little orange line appear and these numbers, that's telling us how much we're crossing that threshold. So there are times when we're going way across it, like 6 dB, which makes sense since it was about 6 dB to 0. And then other times it's a lot more subtle than that. Okay, so this would be more of an application of how something could be used like at the very end of a process if you're driving in really hard. But realistically, we wouldn't even want to see any movement at all. However, you'll hear a big difference when this is on and off. So let's take this to the extreme and go up 18.
Farewell, but whenever you welcome the hour that awakens the night song of mirth in your...
And now let's turn it off.
Farewell, but whenever you welcome the hour that awakens the night song of mirth in your bower, Then think of the friend.
So the other benefit of using something like this is when you do cross that threshold, it's not going to give you digital distortion. It could still give you a distortion characteristic. It can still saturate the sound, and we will be using it to do that in just a little while. But what it's trying to do is, instead of clipping it off so extremely, like you can see right here, it tries to actually give you more of rounded edges. So if I go to the master track right here and I bounce this out, we will indeed see exactly what I'm saying here. All right, when I go in and I look at these edges, what I should notice and see is that we're having a little bit more of a rounding off occur. Okay, from afar, it looks like it's still as squared out, but when I zoom in on this squared out waveform, it's squared out all the way to the top at all times. When I go into this one, you can see how it's tried to round off those edges for me a little bit more while still being quite a bit louder. So the way I would use this when I'm making a song, for example, and I actually personally don't tend to use this. I take the risk of knowing that I could get some kind of weird glitch, because you have to remember, whether you know it or not, whether it's transparent or not, every time you put a processor on to a session, it could be somehow coloring that sound. And that's okay, because in this situation, you know that you have this on here. And so every decision you're making, you're not really thinking or worrying about what this is doing to color the sound. You're making all of your changes accordingly onto the audio tracks. But on the flip side, you could also choose not to use this if you don't really want to. But better safe than sorry. This is how I'd probably set it up. And realistically, we would never be driving this in so hot. We probably would be driving it in at 0, and when we're driving it in here without any additional clip gain or anything else, you'll notice that it is not doing anything here on
Farewell.
a gain reduction.
But whenever you welcome the hour that awakens the night song of mirth in your bower,